Okay, so once again, this is Tony Wright, First Love Christian Church, FLCC, and A.B. Wright Ministries. You know, this is day 34 of the 90-day Bible study. We're going to complete 2 Chronicles, but we're also going to complete the book of Ezra. So as we left off yesterday, Josiah, he had called for a Passover and called all the people together to prepare for it. And the Levites and the priests sanctified themselves, and the people were prepared, and the temple was cleaned and sanctified. And, they observed Passover. Now, sometime after this Passover, the king of Egypt came up into the area, and Josiah had gone out to help in the battle, and he was wounded in that effort. And later, he died. Now, the prophet Jeremiah lamented over this loss, along with all of Judah, though. So the people made his son Jehoahaz king. But after only 3 months, the king of Egypt came and took him captive and put his brother in to reign in his stead. Now, his brother was Eliakim, but the king of Egypt changed his name to Jehoiakim. Changed his name. And Jehoiakim was another one of those that just refused to do things according to the ways of the Lord. And the king of Babylon, King Nebuchadnezzar, came up against Judah and took all the vessels from the house of the Lord, and he took Jehoiakim back to Babylon with him. And his son Jehoiachin reigned in his place, well, for 1 year. Then Nebuchadnezzar came back to Judah, raided the place again, took all the vessels from the house of the Lord again, and then he took Jehoiachin back with him this time. And he put his brother Zedekiah in his place. And Zedekiah, he went against all the things of God. He ignored the warnings of Jeremiah the prophet. And Zedekiah, he also rebelled against King Nebuchadnezzar, who had put him in control in the first place. What? Okay, I know this is not going to go well, is it? No. The people, they followed his action, and all of them transgressed against God. And they did things that even were an abomination to God. Everyone, king, the priest, the Levites, the people, they all did their own thing until God had enough. And then they were all taken into captivity in Babylon. And they were going to remain there in exile for 70 years, just as the prophet Jeremiah had told them. Remember, he said 70 years they were going to be in captivity. Yeah, well, here they were. And they remained there, though, until the first year of the reign of King Cyrus of Persia, because Persia had defeated Babylon. And Cyrus made a decree that the people of Judah could return to their land. They were to return to their land and build a house to their God. And he gave them all the vessels and things that had been taken from Judah by Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon at the time of captivity, because he had captured it when Persia beat Babylon. Now, nearly 50,000 people went back from Babylon to Jerusalem when Cyrus made his decree. And the people, they restored worship there in Jerusalem after about 7 months. And they offered sacrifices and offerings to the Lord. And then they hired masons and carpenters. And they actually began the work to lay the temple foundation in the 2nd year after their return. Now, after that foundation was laid, they did it up. They prayed God, with music and cymbals and trumpets and song. And they said, let's give thanks to the Lord, because he is good and his mercy endures forever to Israel. And for those who were old enough to have seen the first house, they were brought to tears and overcome with joy at the sight of this, the foundation for the second worship house of God. Now, when some of Judah's adversaries found out that they were rebuilding the temple, they came over to, offer to help in the rebuild effort, right? But their help was refused. And they were told that the people of Judah, they would do the work, just like King Cyrus had commanded. Then these adversaries set out to do every single thing they could to deter this work of the people of Judah. And they tried as hard as they could to speak against them and send bad messages and, false accounts up to the king, from the reign of Cyrus all the way up through even to the reign of Darius. But it was in the reign of King Artaxerxes that they had convinced him that Judah was planning an uprising, and that if Judah was successful in building the walls and fortifying the cities, that Judah was going to become a menace to everybody. So Artaxerxes gave a decree that the building had to stop, which these adversaries were only too eager to deliver. So this went on until the second year of King Darius. There was no work done for the rebuilding. But then Zerubbabel, along with Jeshua, they decided to start an effort to restart the work on the house of God. And when the adversaries came to question who gave them permission, they ignored and kept building. So the adversaries, they wrote to Darius and they complained that Judah was doing work that they had been decreed to stop. And Judah, though, wrote that they had been commanded to build by Cyrus the king. So King Darius had a search done to see if King Cyrus had commanded such work. And they found the original decree, which not only said that they were to do the work, but that the expense should be taken care of by the king's house. So Darius made a decree that Tatnai, the governor, and his companions, the old Snoop Dogs, they were to leave this work alone and provide Judah with the money for their expenses and whatever else they needed for the sacrifice and for building material, whatever they need. And under these new conditions, this building progress, it zoomed on like quick. So the project was completed in the 6th year, though, of the reign of Darius. And then the temple was dedicated, and all the priests and the Levites, they were given their assignments again according to what was set forth by Moses way back in the wilderness when they dedicated the temple. And then they observed Passover. Now, about 60 years later, Ezra, a scribe of the law and a prophet of Moses, he led another group of exiles out of Babylon back to Jerusalem. And King Artaxerxes had given him permission to return with a group of children of Israel, and they came out in the 7th year of the king's reign. And the king gave them a letter so that they would be able to take the gold and silver and other belongings with his permission. And whatever Ezra needed up to the limit was to be given to them, as they traveled around. And then the priests and Levites among them, that they were not to be touched, or they didn't have to, they weren't to be told or given fees or assessed on them any way at all. So Ezra was grateful and praised God for granting his request. But Ezra was concerned that traveling with all this valuable stuff they had through territories where people were, very likely to be unfriendly and maybe even hostile, that it was going to be unsafe. But he was ashamed to go back and ask the king to provide, armed escorts, anything like that, because he had told the king that their God had his hands on everybody that seeks him. And, that he made sure that only good came to them and that God would rain down his wrath on anybody that forsakes him or bothers his people. So Ezra fasted and prayed for an answer of what to do. So the answer that came to him was to divide the valuable things among the Levites and the priests, since they would be able to travel without any fear of being intruded on, with that letter that they had from the king. So that's what he did. He divided all of the valuable stuff among the priests and the Levites, and they traveled on to Jerusalem. And God protected them all along the way. Now, 4 days after they arrived back, they went out and they made sacrifice to God, and they gave the king's letter after that to the governors and officials around, because these governors and officials around were to provide them with what they needed, to benefit the people in the temple of God in that process. So they gave what they could to that project. And later, the princes, they came to Ezra and told him how the people of Israel had moved away from God, and they were going about doing their own thing, and they were following the customs of the nations around them. And they had taken wives from these people of those nations, and they had begun to take on their customs and worship their gods and idols and all this stuff. So Ezra, man, he was broken by the disobedience of his people, and he wept and mourned for it all day long. So by the time the evening sacrifices, Ezra, he cried out to God, and he asked for forgiveness for the transgressions of his people. And when he had finished praying before God, a lot of the people around him, they came and assembled around him. They wept too before him and the Lord. And one of the people came up to Ezra and said, I know we've sinned and we've taken wives from the people of this land around us, and we need to make a covenant to put those wives and the children born of these marriages away. And we need to do things according to the law. So Ezra, he said to to these Levites and the priests and really to all of Israel that they need to agree to do that. So the people, what they did is they agreed to assemble back in 3 days. And whoever didn't come was going to have to forfeit all their belongings, and they were going to be separated from the congregation of these returned exiles because obviously they didn't want to follow God. But in 3 days when they gathered back, all the people were there. So Ezra told them that they would have to separate themselves from the wives that they had taken from these other nations, and they all agreed that they would do so. But they had to spread this process out over time because there were so many of them to separate. So they did. They scheduled it out over time and they separated them, family by family. But it took time. But speaking of time, we've come to the end of Ezra and the end of today's reading. It's time for us to move out. But we'll hit you back in a short. So until we connect again, you keep reading and rolling on in this word and keep checking us out on the social media platform of your choice. Take a few minutes to tell your friends and tell your neighbors that FLCC, we're definitely on the move and we're taking ministry back to the first love. Peace.